I'm Jerry Lewis, and this is my story. I don't remember much about the first 7 years of my life. What I do remember is that at the age of 7, for some reason, my mom and my brother and I were in a hotel room. And my dad came to the door, and he sat on one bed, and my brother and I sat on the other. And Dad told us that my brother, my mom, and I were going to be leaving to go live with our grandparents for a while. It took me a while to understand that, but that was, my parents were getting a divorce. And the good thing that happened through that was that next summer, I trusted Jesus, and through the influence of my grandmother. But the thing that I didn't realize at the time, it set me on a pattern that really became the pattern of my life. And the pattern is this: work hard, do the right things, do the right things exceptionally, achieve success and recognition, and earn approval. Nobody ever told me, my dad didn't tell me that my parents' divorce was my fault. And I didn't ever think of it consciously, but I think there was something inside me all the time that says, I've got to make sure that I am loved and approved and accepted. And the way to do that is through being successful and through working hard and doing all the things that you're supposed to do. And that became true in ministry. I mean, the resume part of my life is that when I was 15 years old, my church invited me to become the music director. And that led to a college degree, 2 seminary degrees, music and youth minister at church, 20 years as a senior pastor, 17 of them in the same church, and then the last 13 and a half years as the executive director and lead strategist of Harvest Baptist Association. Underneath all that were still those things: work hard, do the right thing, make people happy, achieve and succeed, and then you will be approved. And I don't blame my circumstances or my education or my training or anything for that, but the message was there. If you do those things, then God has an important work for you to do. And if I do it exceptionally, then He'll really be pleased. That was the big lie. And I didn't realize it was a lie because it sounds good, and I was hearing it a lot. God has a great work for you to do. A few years ago, I discovered a quote by Dallas Willard, who's become one of my favorite authors. And he said, "Grace is not opposed to effort, but it's opposed to earning." My efforts to earn approval have resulted in near burnout 3 or 4 different times over the course of the year. Here's the truth that changed everything for me. When I went from God has an important work for me to do to God has an amazing life for me to live. And to that end, I want to talk about sabbatical. I had my first sabbatical after 30 years of full-time ministry. In 2018, after 10 years in my current ministry, I was about at that point, still doing all those things, even though I knew better. Still trying to prove myself, and I was at the end. And so I threw out a lifeline, I guess, to my association leadership and said, I think I need a sabbatical. And I brought them the proposal. First, we approved a policy. I brought them the policy first, and if they hadn't approved that, then I wouldn't have brought up the proposal. But since they did, I did. And so I got a month sabbatical. And for me, it was it was about rest. It was about recovery. But what I chose to do during that time was to to spend time reading and studying and reflecting on the concept of sabbatical and Sabbath, because those things are related. The idea of sabbatical comes from the biblical concept of Sabbath. And I did a lot of reading on that topic, both leading up to and during the course of my sabbatical. One of the books that I read during my sabbatical was by Wayne Cordero, Leading on Empty. And it's his own story of his experience with burnout and trying to figure out how to recover from that, and then sharing with others some things that he learned along the way so that they would not experience the same things he did. One of the chapters in the book is a chapter about sabbatical. And there are some things in that chapter that for me, I think are really helpful. He shares three different metaphors. One of them is, he talks about Michael Jordan, who is, arguably the greatest basketball player ever. But after winning 3 consecutive NBA championships with the Chicago Bulls, Michael Jordan retired and went and played baseball for a year. It cost him a lot in terms of people making fun of him. Couldn't hit a curveball, spent his time playing right field. But then he came back. He comes back to the NBA and wins 3 more NBA championships. The thing that Cordero said in there was, he said, Michael Jordan didn't retire because he had lost his edge or lost his abilities or anything else. What happened is he lost his hunger. And during that year of being out in right field, he got his hunger back and came back and won 3 more NBA championships. So part of the sabbatical metaphor is the metaphor of hunger. It's a way to get your hunger back for ministry. A second metaphor he uses is one of energy, and he talked about how a jumbo jet takes off and uses 1/3 of its resources in the process of taking off and getting to altitude. Once it gets to altitude, the plane pretty much flies itself and doesn't burn nearly as much fuel. But it's that taking off part and gaining altitude that takes so much. And the truth is that as leaders, as pastors, our job is not to fly the plane on autopilot. Our job is to try to help the church gain altitude, to take off and move forward. Then a third thing that he talked about was the metaphor of roadblocks. He mentioned 3 specific roadblocks to sabbatical. One of them is the expectations of others. And the truth of the matter is that everybody's got ideas for what you're supposed to do. Whether it was in my ministry as a pastor or even in my current ministry, everybody else has lots of ideas about the things that I need to be doing. But nobody else is going to help me guard my heart. Nobody else is going to protect my margin. Nobody else is going to hold me accountable for healthy rhythms. Over the years, even before my current ministry, I spent a lot of time talking to young pastors. I had seminary students come through on my staff when I was a pastor. And one of the things I told them when they went to pastor their first church was, here's what you need to do. You take your day off the first week you're there. You determine your schedule and when you're going to be there. And you've got to be able to share those things and develop your own margin, because nobody in your church is going to tell you when it's time to go home. And nobody in your church is going to tell you you're working too hard. In fact, they will brag to their neighbors about how hard their pastor works. They will love you for working so hard. But you've got to determine what your own rhythms are and be able to live with those. A second roadblock you talked about was finances. When the idea of a sabbatical comes up, well, how are we going to pay for this? How's the church going to pay for somebody else to come preach and then still pay my salary? What other expenses are going to be? Am I going to be able to afford to do anything but sit at home? Which, by the way, may not be a bad idea. That was the thing that I did the most on my sabbatical. But so there are things that the church needs to put in place, things in terms of policies, things in terms of maybe planning for a sabbatical that the church can be putting a little bit aside to prepare for that. One great thing for Texas Baptists that's new is that Texas Baptists have a pastor sabbatical grant program that they've just introduced. And you can find information about that. I think it'll probably be at the end of this video. And then another thing that he talked about was leadership. Who's going to fill the gaps? Who's going to lead the church while I'm out? Who's going to do the things that I do? How can I really unplug? I'd encourage you to pick up this book and take a look at not only the sabbatical chapter, but all the other things that went along with it. It's a powerful resource. One of the things that I learned through, and I have to keep learning, let's be honest about that, I have to keep learning, but is if you're depending on that significant getaway sabbatical every few years and not living in healthy rhythms, those sabbatical times away are going to be about recovery every time. They won't be about renewal and refocus and recharging. And so we've got to recover the idea of Sabbath. And what that means is the rhythms of rest and work that God established in creation and shared with us in His Word. Well, the last thing I wanted to mention are just some sabbatical resources. I mentioned already Cordero's book. There's another book that I brought with me, and that's a book that was written by the Texas Associational Directors of Missions Network. The idea came about as there were about 4 of us who are in this network that thought, what can we do to help people on their ministry journey and share with them some guardrails, some things to protect their ministry. One of the chapters that I happen to write is a chapter on Sabbath, but I'd encourage you to pick up this book as well. And the other thing that was really beneficial to me in my own sabbatical was I kept a journal. I've journaled on and off different times in my life. I haven't been consistent with it, but one of the things that I know is that when I have been consistent with it, it's always been meaningful. But when I got ready for my sabbatical, I knew that a part of it was going to be keeping a journal. And so here's what I did, and here's the pro tip for sabbaticals. I went and bought a journal this is my sabbatical journal. The only thing written in here was what I wrote every day during my sabbatical. And the blank pages at the end will be ready for my next sabbatical, but there's nothing else that's in here. And I recorded my reflections every day on what I had read. I did a lot of reading, read a lot of books over the scripture passage that I read, the things that I reflected on in my own life. One of the books that I read was a book by Henry Nouwen, and it was actually his journal of his sabbatical. And the most beneficial part of that book for me was it taught me how to journal. And so I have both on my website, which is drgerrylewis.com, and our association website, harvestba.org, I have some sabbatical resources. And actually, either one of those, either harvestba.org/sabbatical or drgerrylewis.com/sabbatical. I have a sample sabbatical policy that a church could use, a sample sabbatical proposal. And so there are lots of other things out there, but I've tried to at least pull those together so that a number of different sabbatical resources can be found in one place. And then the other thing that I have done, and I'm happy to do for any pastor, and that is to help with coaching, either to prepare for sabbatical or during sabbatical. I know that one of the things that's offered with Texas Baptist sabbatical is if requested, they offer pastoral counseling sessions for the pastor. I am not a counselor, so I can't offer that, but I can offer coaching. And you can contact me at contactgerrylewis@gmail.com. My prayer is that pastors and leaders would develop healthy rhythms, would be able to rest in the reality that you don't need to do anything to get God's approval. You have God's approval. That doesn't mean He doesn't expect you to do anything, but it puts what you do in a whole different perspective when you're doing it because you're called, and it's a response, a grateful response that God approves of who you are. And that's a lesson that I need to remind myself of over and over again. And it's a lesson that I hope you will learn as well. And I appreciate getting to share it with you.